Hello and welcome to this audio commentary for Owen Land's A Film of Their 1973 Spring Tour, commissioned by Christian World Liberation Front of Berkeley, California. I'm Stephen Broomer of Art and Trash. Owen Land, born George Landow, was one of the primary figures of the structural filmmaking movement. In his work, one could find an uncommon comic sensibility that was broad in scope, a tour of language and spirituality focused often on the apparatus itself. He was eternally testing the limits of cinema with maximalist, multiform structures that integrated complex compositing, loop printing, sketch comedy digressions, text on screen. His films burst with prankish joy even when they followed an insistent program, often deriving pleasures from wordplay and anachronism. A film of their 1973 spring tour differs from this, electing instead to pursue a singular form of alternating streams of image and sound. But nonetheless, it's comic and joyous. It doesn't invoke language in the direct and multimodal ways that Land does elsewhere, with slogans and punning titles. Rather, it is narrowly focused on the melding of speech and sound and vision across distance, all in the service of our perception. Land pursues a form here that is maximalist in extremity, in its desire to condense two strings of unrelated sound and image into the length of one. He trusts the sieve of our perception to sort these things out. The technique is abrasive, so let me map it out for you plainly. Land is alternating two strips of film taken at different times, with different subjects, different locations, alternated 3 frames at a time. So for every 3 frames of image A, there are 3 frames of image B, in substitute of the next 3 frames of image A. It's perpetuated thus: AAA, BBB, AAA, BBB. In this way it sheds half of each image and sound component as it goes, carving out fissures in our perception and filling in those gaps with a separate text of sound and image that is at times blank, sound that is at times silent. Our eyes and ears are missing each of those eighth of a second passages when film A switches to film B and vice versa. We lose 12 frames per second on either strip, but our mind fills in the absence of this. It fills in the missing fragments of words. It fills in the missing stations of image. In this way, a film of their 1973 spring tour is an essential experiment in perception, playing with the perceptual restoration effect, that is, the ability of the brain to fill in that missing information, as in the phoneme restoration effect, which finds the brain filling in missing letters from words, missing syllables from strings of sound.
And that, for various kinds of scenes, and sometimes there were disappointments involved. Whenever there was any kind of thing going on, finding that scene.
It's a beautiful condition of the brain that it desires to fill in absences with meaning, a condition that's inevitably tied to the capacity of the imagination to be trained to expect and anticipate logical constructions, echoes of existing knowledge, and past perceptions. As universal as perceptual restoration is, who among us hasn't misheard a word because our brain filled in a gap incorrectly? It is perhaps more easily understood in the visual disruption of image, here, as Land alternates between compositions that force our brains to do something else, which is to combine them. It's a unique quality realized at the alternating rate of 3 frames per second. It's an effect that I've not seen repeated in single-frame alternations that are common to, say, Paul Sherritt's films. That here I see enough of a stable image in those eighth of a second bursts that my brain starts to combine and mix the two streams. For me, this is most clearly realized when one stream is static and the other is moving, for it forces me to see 2 foregrounds and 2 backgrounds, 2 subjects and 2 settings, but only one that is changing rapidly through movement, and I begin to become confused as to which subject occupies which background. That Land presents us with this image collision and this sound collision at once makes the piece all the more maximalist, overwhelming, chaotic, playful, and all the more unnatural in its perceptual restoration. We're much more likely to make mistakes amidst this chaos. It pushes the limits of visual perception, much like the more aggressive, non-representational flicker films of Peter Kubelka, Tony Conrad, and Paul Sharits, or for that matter, the representational flicker films of Sharits and later Rose Lauder and Martin Arnold, films that could provoke visual hallucinations or that could speed the eye into territories of self-deception. What Land is doing is more than just alternation or flicker. It is highly intentioned, textual disruption that begs the mind to absorb information, both visual and oral, in double time. Land's work is also provocative in his choice of subject matter, and on that note, it must be observed that he is not applying this perceptual trickery to just any footage, that his selection of a subject is chosen with intention, or rather, it chose him. Spiritual inspirations underlie a great deal of Land's work, and whether that work involved integrating madrigals and the Confessions of St. Augustine, as he does in Wide Angle Saxon, or tricking the eye into seeing a car show model as a wizened holy man, as he does in Thank You, Jesus, for the Eternal Present, Land's concern with matters of faith was at least seriocomic. It wasn't just a kind of punning sarcasm. He was raised in a conservative Jewish family, but he came of age a skeptic, and later pursued a wide range of religious texts in search of what he would eventually land on, described by P. Adams Sitney as a fusion of Christianity and Tantra, but a fusion that was informed by many faiths, both esoteric and mainstream. His work is thus perhaps the most significant encounter a 20th century absurdist comic wit, let alone an experimental filmmaker, ever had with the contemplation and interpretation of religious texts. Land was commissioned to make a film documenting a cross-country tour undertaken by members of the Christian World Liberation Front. There's no doubt that the CWLF knew what they were doing. Their tour was an evangelical retread of the Merry Pranksters' celebrated 1964 campus tour. They were interested in new forms of public address, which came from the attitude of their local community, the counterculture of Berkeley, which had a bombastic, theatrical, confrontational style of communication. Their tour would lead them to conservative Christian groups in seminaries and colleges throughout the United States. From here, it's a short journey to derive from Land's formal approach a deeper resonance, that of transcending denominational difference, transcending the divisions that erupt between differing interpretations of texts, warring definitions of the authenticity of texts, and conflicting views of what makes for a good life. In the act of subdividing our perceptions and combining them, Land reflects the spirit of these meetings and what they represent in a broader and deeper history. The film is crammed full of more information than can be accepted by our perception, much as the history of holy books is one of singular statement dividing out into manifold interpretations. It isn't so much that the piety of the conservatives and the universalism of the CWLF become one, because they don't. They aren't really reconciled, it's a trick of the eye. You lay the film strip out on a table, you look at its alternating passages, you see its waveform, and you can see that these remain objectively distinct images and sounds. For the most part, of meetings documented in the direct, unenhanced style of cinema verite. But in our perception, they have something more like a dialogue, perhaps a closer dialogue than is possible in a seminar or conference format, perhaps a more productive dialogue between ideas, between presences, than is imaginable in the hallowed grace and silence of such a tour. I don't think Land's project can be boiled down to a singular meaning, let alone a lesson, because he wasn't a didactic thinker. But still this provokes in me the thought that if we speak over each other in everyday life, if we speak over each other to drown out the other, if we speak over each other with such force that we cloud our vision, then we're in a kind of limbo of ordinary perception, the limbo of documental witness, the limbo of dailiness. But when we open ourselves up to polyphony, like this polyphony that Land is shaping through the intermittent mechanism of the camera and the projector and our ability to keep up with it, then that polyphony is the salvation and redemption of perception. Perhaps that's too painfully earnest a motive to assign to a filmmaker whose work was often composed of tides of mocking laughter aimed at all the sacred cows that surrounded him. But then, this is not a film that sits easily in his filmography. Is what we are experiencing an act of perceptual restoration, or is it a new transfiguration, a blending of bodies and spaces to cast out the ordinary vision of everyday life, to build instead a holy vision of a newly exalted reality?